The gallery was packed, but I only had eyes for him. Liam, tall, broad shoulders, and that messy chestnut hair. He moved like he owned the place, weaving between the paintings with such ease like he belonged there. I couldn't stop staring. He paused in front of a large abstract piece, head tilted, studying it like it had all the answers. I could feel the buzz in the air between us, even though he hadn't noticed me yet. But when his eyes finally flicked my way green, sharp, it hit me like a punch to the chest. My stomach flipped. He gave a small smile, just the corner of his lips, then turned back to the painting. I wasn't going to let the moment slip. I moved through the crowd, heart pounding, and stopped beside him. "Beautiful piece," I said, gesturing to the canvas. "Abstract, but it pulls you in." He didn't take his eyes off the painting. "It does. But I think it's the people who pull you in more." Then, finally, he looked at me. "I'm Liam." His gaze was intense, like he could see right through me. "Thomas," I said, holding out my hand. When he took it, I felt that electric jolt again, like the entire world had zeroed in on this moment. "Thomas," he repeated, his voice low, and he held my hand a second too long. "What brings you here?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool, even though I could barely breathe. "I come to these events sometimes. The art scene is interesting." Liam raised an eyebrow. "Interesting," he smiled. "Is that what you call it?" I laughed, feeling the tension crack a bit. "Let's just say I don't come here for the wine." That smile again, but this time it reached his eyes. He took a step closer. "Then why are you here?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. Instead, I glanced at the painting again, but all I could think about was him standing too close, the warmth of his body radiating toward mine. Liam's question still hung between us. Why was I here? I could have said something clever, but the way he looked at me like he was waiting for more, I couldn't come up with anything fast enough. Before I had a chance to recover, he leaned in, just slightly lowering his voice. "You're not an artist, are you?" I shook my head. "No, just a fan. You." He tilted his head, considering me for a moment. "I dabble. Photography. But mostly I appreciate." "Seems like you appreciate more than just the art," I said before I could stop myself. His eyes flickered, that grin twitching at the corners of his mouth. "Bold move, Thomas." "You caught me," he said. His voice was smooth, a little too smooth. "But I'm still trying to figure you out." "Well, good luck with that," I muttered, pretending to focus on the painting again. Anything to break his gaze. But it was no use. I could feel his eyes on me. I like a challenge. The way he said it, direct, but calm, sent a thrill through me. I turned back to him. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Well, I think you know," he said. "And I think you like it." A silence fell between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, the energy was crackling more than ever. That tension that pulled between us, it was unmistakable now. "I've really enjoyed this," he said, his voice quieter now, more personal. "Talking to you?" I swallowed, suddenly aware of how close we were standing. "Yeah," I replied, barely able to speak. "Same." He checked his watch, frowning a little. "I have to get going, but I'd like to continue this conversation." He paused, looking at me in a way that left no doubt about his intentions. "Somewhere more private." My heart was racing. This was at the moment where things changed. I didn't have to think twice. "Yeah," I said, nodding. "Let's go." Without another word, we moved through the thinning crowd, heading toward the door like we both knew exactly where this was leading. We slipped out of the gallery into the cool night air. Liam didn't waste any time. "Your place nearby?" "Yeah," I managed, still catching my breath. The streets felt quieter than usual, almost surreal after the buzzing energy inside, but I barely noticed. All I could focus on was Liam walking beside me, so close that our shoulders brushed with every step. He shot me a sideways glance, that same playful smirk lingering. "Good," he said, pulling out his phone. A quick swipe, and he had a car on the way. "Let's make this easy." We stood there, the city humming around us, but it felt like we were in our own bubble. I was buzzing with adrenaline, anticipation heavy in the air. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was thick with everything we both knew was coming. When the car pulled up, Liam opened the door, gesturing for me to get in first. His hand brushed my lower back, sending a spark through me. I slid inside, and he followed. The second the door closed, the atmosphere shifted. The space between us felt too small, too charged. I could feel the heat radiating off him as we sat there, our thighs pressed together in the backseat. I kept my eyes forward, trying not to give away how badly I wanted to turn and close the gap completely. But then his hand moved slowly, casually over his leg until it rested against mine. I nearly forgot how to breathe. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, but the tension was impossible to ignore. The ride felt endless, the city lights flashing by in a blur, but my focus was locked on him. Finally, we pulled up to my building. The driver barely had time to stop before I opened the door and stepped out. Liam followed, and without waiting, he was right beside me again, closer this time, his presence overwhelming. As we reached the door to my apartment, I fumbled for the keys, nerves kicking in, but before I could even get them in the lock, Liam moved behind me, his hand covering mine, steadying it. The moment froze, his breath warm against my neck. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost teasing. I nodded. though I wasn't sure I could speak. I pushed the door open, stepping inside, and he followed, shutting it softly behind us. The click of the lock felt final, like there was no turning back now. As soon as the door clicked shut, Liam was on me. He didn't waste a second, pressing me against the wall, his mouth crashing onto mine. It was rough, desperate. I barely had time to catch my breath before I was kissing him back just as hard. His hands were everywhere, running up my chest, gripping my shoulders, tugging me closer. I couldn't think straight. It was like everything around us disappeared, and all that mattered was his body against mine. The heat. The urgency. Thomas, he breathed against my lips, his voice low and rough, like he was barely holding himself together. I didn't respond, just grabbed the back of his neck and pulled him closer, feeling the tension in his muscles as I dragged him toward the bedroom. We stumbled through the hallway, bumping into walls, neither of us willing to let go. I barely managed to kick the door open before we fell onto the bed, tangled up in each other. He was on top of me in an instant, his weight pressing me down into the mattress, and I didn't want him to move. Didn't want this moment to stop. His lips trailed down my neck, and my breath hitched. I tugged at his shirt, desperate to feel his skin. He pulled back just long enough to yank it off, and then he was back, kissing me harder, deeper, like he couldn't get enough. The room felt like it was spinning, and I couldn't tell where I ended, and he began. Everything was a blur of heat, skin, and sensation, and I was lost in it, lost in him. We broke apart for a second, panting, eyes locked. The look in his eyes was something I hadn't seen before, intense, almost possessive. It sent a shiver down my spine. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice rough, a little breathless. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "Yeah, I managed. I'm sure." That was all he needed. He kissed me again, slower this time, but no less intense. And when he pulled me closer, it felt like the world was fading away, leaving only the two of us, tangled together in the heat of the moment. The room felt like it was on fire. Every touch, every kiss, it was all consuming. Liam moved over me with purpose, like he knew exactly what I needed without me saying a word. I was completely lost in him, my body responding to his in ways I hadn't expected. His lips brushed my collarbone, and I couldn't stop the soft gasp that escaped me. He grinned against my skin, clearly liking the effect he was having, and it sent a thrill through me. I tugged him closer, fingers digging into his back as our bodies pressed together. I wanted more. I needed more. "Liam," I whispered, barely able to form words between breaths. He looked up, his eyes dark with intensity, his hands firm but gentle as they roamed over my chest. There was something in the way he touched me, like he was discovering something new, something he had been craving. It wasn't just lust. It felt deeper. He slowed down, his lips trailing over my jawline, down to my neck again, each kiss lingering. My pulse quickened, but the frantic energy from before had shifted. Now it was something else, something quieter but just as powerful. I found myself wrapping my legs around his waist, pulling him even closer, not wanting to let him go, not even for a second. He responded with a low growl that reverberated through his chest, and I could feel the heat between us building again. "You're incredible," he murmured against my skin, his voice husky and breathless. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands found their way into his hair, pulling him into another kiss. This time it was slower, deeper, like we were both trying to savor every second. Everything about this felt right. We moved together in perfect sync, the rhythm of our bodies matching as if we had done this 1,000 times before. The room was filled with nothing but the sound of our breathing, our shared heat. In that moment, nothing else mattered. It was just us, lost in each other. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. We were both panting, our eyes locked, and I could see the connection. It wasn't just about the physical, there was something more, something that had been brewing from the moment we met. I opened my mouth to say something, but before the words could come, he kissed me again, slow, tender, and just like that, I knew we were far from done. We lay there, tangled up in the sheets, our breathing still heavy, the heat between us gradually cooling. The air had shifted, though. Where there had been fire, there was now a strange, unsettling quiet. Liam was still close, his arm draped over me, his chest rising and falling against my side, but I could sense it, the tension creeping back in. He hadn't said anything for a while. Neither had I. I wasn't sure if this was the time for words, but something was off. I turned to look at him, his face inches from mine, eyes closed, but his expression had changed. He wasn't relaxed. "Everything okay?" I asked, breaking the silence, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a deep breath, his fingers idly tracing circles on my chest. "Thomas," he started, his voice low, like he was weighing each word before it left his mouth. "There's something I need to tell you." The way he said it made my stomach drop. I sat up a little, tension building in my own body now. "What is it?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything before he even said the words. My mind raced. What was it? Something about him? About us? He sighed, running a hand through his hair, looking like he was about to say something that could change everything. "I'm engaged," he said finally, his voice almost too quiet, like he didn't want it to exist, to a woman. The words hung in the air between us, heavy, sharp. I blinked, trying to process what I'd just heard. But it didn't make sense. It felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind right out of me. Engaged to a woman. I sat up fully now, pushing the sheet off me, trying to get a little distance from him. Though the bed felt impossibly small all of a sudden, it was all I could manage. Her name's Sarah, he continued, still not meeting my eyes. We've been together for years. Everyone expects us to get married. Our families, our friends. I haven't told anyone about this side of me. Until now. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in. You're telling me this now? After everything my words cut off, my mind reeling. I know, and I'm sorry. He sat up too, his voice pleading now. I shouldn't have let it go this far, but I didn't know how to stop. This felt right, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't pretending. I wasn't hiding. His words hung there, and I didn't know what to say. Anger, confusion, and something else, something deeper swirled inside me. I wanted to yell at him, to demand answers, but all I could feel was the ache of betrayal settling in. So what now? I asked, my voice sounding hollow. You go back to her? Pretend this didn't happen. He didn't answer right away. His silence said more than words could. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I could barely think. My mind kept circling back to those words, engaged, to someone else. A woman. Every second of our night together replayed in my head, now tinged with something sour, something wrong. Liam sat there, eyes downcast, like he couldn't bear to face what he'd just thrown between us. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to lash out, but all I felt was this gnawing pain in my chest. Why didn't you tell me? I finally asked, my voice strained. It was the only thing I could say, the only thing that made sense. He dragged a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated with himself. I didn't plan this, Thomas. I didn't expect any of this to happen. He paused, looking up at me with those intense green eyes, now full of guilt. I couldn't stop. From the moment we met, I knew there was something between us. And yet, here we are, I muttered, sitting up on the edge of the bed, trying to create some distance, both physical and emotional. I couldn't look at him right now, not with the weight of his confession still pressing down on me. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, moving closer, but I shifted, not letting him touch me. It's just complicated. That's one way to put it, I shot back, my frustration finally bubbling to the surface. You're engaged, Liam. How do you think this makes me feel? You're not just some guy, you're someone else's fiancé. You didn't think that was important to mention before we... I didn't want to lie to you, he interrupted, his voice rising but then softening. I just didn't know how to say it. I stood up, pacing the room now. I couldn't sit still. My head was pounding, trying to make sense of everything. What are you even doing with me then? Is this just some kind of experiment for you? You play around with me, then go back to your real life with her? His face twisted with pain. No, it's not like that. Then what is it? I snapped, stopping in front of him, demanding an answer. I don't know, he burst out, finally standing, his voice raw. I don't know, Thomas. I've been with Sarah for years, but something's always felt off, like there's a part of me I've been denying, hiding. And then I met you. And it's like he trailed off, shaking his head. I've never felt like this before. Ever, not with her. Not with anyone. His words hit hard. They were sincere, I could tell, but they didn't fix anything. They didn't erase the reality of the situation. You can't have it both ways, I said, quieter now, the heat in my voice fading into something more fragile. You can't have me and her. He looked away, his hands on his hips, chest rising and falling as he struggled with what to say next. I know that. There was a pause, and the weight of his indecision hung thick in the air. I wanted him to choose, but I was terrified of what that choice would be. Liam stood there, still silent, and that silence was worse than any answer he could have given. It was the uncertainty, the fact that he couldn't just say what we both knew had to be said. I crossed my arms, trying to hold myself together, waiting for him to explain. I didn't expect this to happen, he finally said, his voice strained. Not with you. Not with anyone. I shook my head, not buying it. You expect me to believe that? You show up, you flirt. I stopped myself, not wanting to say it, not wanting to give weight to what we'd just done. You've been living a lie, Liam. How do you expect to move forward from this? With her? With me? He sighed, running his hand over his face like he was trying to erase the mess he'd created. I don't know. I don't know what to do, Thomas. Do you love her? The question came out sharper than I intended. I wasn't sure I even wanted the answer, but I had to know. Liam looked up, startled by the bluntness of it. But then his face softened. I care about her. We've been together for so long, and it's comfortable. But love, not like this. His eyes met mine, and I could see the truth in them. Not like this. His words hung between us, and for a split second I let myself feel the rush of what that meant. But reality was quick to rush back in. He was still engaged. He still had a life tied to someone else, and I was just a complication. I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to clear my thoughts. You're going to have to make a choice, Liam. You can't just sit here and feel sorry for yourself while dragging me and her through the mud. I know, he said, stepping toward me. And I don't want to hurt you. I never expected to meet you. It's like everything I thought I knew is falling apart, and you're the reason. That's not fair, I said, backing up slightly. I didn't want to hear it. You can't put this all on me. I'm not, he said quickly. But I can't ignore what I feel for you. I've never felt this way about anyone. His words were like a punch to the gut, both exhilarating and terrifying. I could feel my anger softening, but the hurt was still there, sharp and real. I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that what we had was different, but I couldn't ignore the facts. You have to talk to her, I said, my voice quieter now. You have to tell her the truth. He looked at me, a flash of panic crossing his face. And then what? I lose her. I lose you. What am I supposed to do? I didn't have the answer, and neither did he. We were stuck in this terrible in-between, and I didn't know how much longer I could take it. Liam paced across the room, his shoulders tense, his hand raking through his hair like he was trying to pull out the right answer. But there wasn't one. I can't just destroy everything, he muttered, more to himself than to me. Our family's the wedding? It's all set in motion? What will everyone think? I stayed quiet, watching him spiral. The weight of his world was crashing down, and part of me felt for him. But the other part? I was pissed. He was worried about his image, about what people would say, and here I was, standing in the middle of the wreckage, trying to pick up the pieces. You're thinking about everyone but the two people you're hurting the most, I said finally, my voice tight. Sarah doesn't deserve this, and I sure as hell don't. He stopped pacing, turning to face me. His eyes were clouded with confusion, guilt, and something else, fear. I could see it. He was terrified of losing control, terrified of what this meant for him. I don't want to lose you, he said, the vulnerability in his voice cutting through the tension, but I don't know if I'm ready to let go of everything else either. I clenched my fists, trying to keep myself together. You can't have both, Liam. You either end it with her or we're done. I'm not going to be your secret, some side thing you run to when you're bored or conflicted. He took a step toward me, but I held my ground. It's not like that, he said, almost pleading. This, what we have, it's not something I can just walk away from. Then prove it, I shot back, my heart pounding. Prove that you're serious. Tell her the truth. Face what you've been avoiding all this time. His jaw clenched, and I could see the conflict tearing him apart. He was standing on a cliff about to jump, and I was the one pushing him. Part of me hated myself for it. But the other part, the part that had fallen for him, needed this. I needed him to make a decision, to stop dragging me through the mud of his indecision. I don't want to hurt her, he said softly, his eyes full of pain. Then don't lie to her anymore, I replied, my voice hard. She deserves the truth. So do I. We stood there, staring at each other, the room suddenly too small for all the things unsaid between us. The weight of his choice was crushing, but I couldn't let myself be dragged under by it. I can't make this choice for you, I said, quieter now, my voice almost breaking, but I can make one for myself. His eyes snapped to mine, panic flashing across his face. Thomas, if you can't be honest with her, with yourself, then I'm walking away. For good. The silence that followed was heavy. This was it. The line had been drawn. Now all that was left was for him to decide which side he was on. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I could see it in his eyes, the war raging inside him, the weight of everything about to crash down. Liam stood there, frozen, as if one wrong move would shatter everything. I need time, he finally said, his voice low, almost broken. My stomach twisted. Time. Of course he'd asked for time, but I knew better. Time wasn't going to fix this. I can't wait around for you to figure it out, I said, swallowing hard. I'm not asking for much, Liam, just honesty. And if you can't give me that, then I paused, my heart pounding in my chest. It hurt to say it, but I knew I had to. Then I'm done. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he just stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Regret, fear, or was it just guilt? I grabbed my shirt from the floor, pulling it over my head, trying to focus on anything but the look in his eyes. I had to keep moving, had to get out. This wasn't going to end the way I'd hoped, and the longer I stayed, the harder it would be to walk away. I'm sorry, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to hurt you. Yeah, well, I muttered, not turning around. Sometimes wanting isn't enough. I reached for the door, my hand hovering over the handle for a second too long. Part of me was still hoping he'd say something, that he'd stop me, tell me he was ready to make the choice. But he didn't. And that silence, that damn silence, told me everything. I turned the handle and stepped out, the cold air from the hallway hitting me like a slap to the face. I kept walking down the hall out of the building until I was outside, standing under the streetlights, the night strangely quiet. It was over. I had walked away. But even as the fresh air filled my lungs, the ache in my chest didn't fade. I'd given him a choice. And maybe I already knew the answer when I stepped through that door. Maybe part of me knew all along. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not really.